Praise be to God that thou hast attained. Thou hast come to see a prisoner and an exile. We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations, yet they deem us a stirrer up of strife and sedition worthy of bondage and banishment. That all nations should become one in faith and all men as brothers, that the bonds of affection and unity between the sons of men should be strengthened, that diversity of religion should cease, and differences of race be annulled. What harm is there in this? Yet so it shall be. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come. Baha'u'llah.
Thank you. So today we're really happy to have Dr. Robert C. Henderson, and he'll be talking about the impending unity of the world as predicted by the Baha'i writings. Dr. Henderson is a principal consultant for the Henderson Consulting Group, specializing in the development of high-performance organizations and providing services in management consulting, organization development, leadership, coaching, and diversity. Dr. Henderson was appointed a United States Federal Commissioner on the Martin Luther King Jr. Federal Holiday Commission. At the invitation of President Bill Clinton, he spoke to a White House conference on social and economic development and participated in a series of White House meetings on development strategy, focusing on international debt reorganization and food security. He designed and led meetings of California Supreme Court members, judges, and lawyers to establish a California State Supreme Court Commission on Race and Ethnic Bias. He was an elected member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, the Baha'i Faith Senior National Administrative Institution. Dr. Henderson holds a doctoral degree in education in learning theory and management from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So with that, I'm really happy to hand it off to Dr. Henderson.
Well, good morning, everybody. I see a number of really old friends. I don't think I should say old, but Randy Gottlieb, I saw your smiling face and I was so happy to see you. I've got to say, the first time I met Randy was on the Yakima, was in Yakima, Washington, and we were going to the reservation. And she was the primary organizer of an initiative to bring the entire community together, educate youth and children, and facilitate interracial unity. And she was doing it in a town that was predominated by white supremacists. And yet, fearless and intrepid, she persevered. And the very same smile that you see gracing her face right now was the one that melted the hearts of those folks and really invited them to join the circle of unity that she was describing. So Randy, it is just with so much love and admiration that I see your face and just mention a couple of the many heroic things that you've done in the service of humanity. Friends, we talk a lot about the condition of our world, and we are all very anxious about the state of our nation and the state of our world. And I just wanted to make a few comments about aspects of the constructive development of a new society that are going on right under our noses. I want to describe a little bit about the dynamics of conflict, but I also want to describe some of the constructive forces that are remaking society that we ought to be paying attention to, and that the Baha'i Faith is especially concerned about and wanting to aid and reinforce. I want to take us back for a moment to the perilous events of January 6th, 2021, when we in insurrectionists storm the Capitol of the United States on the occasion of the formalization of the results of the presidential election. And you all remember how horrified all of us were when we saw people armed, angry, violent, storming the Capitol, injuring and killing human beings, and marching the Confederate flag through the Capitol Rotunda, where the Senate and the Congress was convened to formalize the election. Sometime after January 6th, several studies were done to help us understand who these people were, what they were concerned about, where they came from, and what they wanted to accomplish. Those studies were done by the University of Chicago and the Center for the Study of Security and Threats, and by the Brookings Institute. And there were 4 studies in all. And what they found was surprising. First of all, they found that the overwhelming majority of the people who stormed the Capitol and gathered on that day were affluent and very well educated. There was a very small minority that were working class or had a lower income than that. But the majority of them were accomplished and financially viable. Secondly, they found that the overwhelming majority of the participants in January 6th came from blue states, not red states. So they were not only from blue states, but they were from blue cities. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Boston, they were from places that you would least expect the insurrectionists to arise. But they had come because of the change they saw in the places they lived and their fear about what those changes would bring. So the big question asked repeatedly by the University of Chicago and by the Brookings Institute was, why did you do this? And 93% of the participants had the very same answer. They were afraid that in 2042, the majority of the American population would be peoples of color, and that the white majority, which had been, in their view, in charge of the institutions and governance and direction of American society, would fall into the minority, and they would lose control of a nation they felt it was their birthright to guide. So here you have a nation whose founding motto is E pluribus unum. Out of many people, we will forge one people. You have a nation who was founded on the idea of freedom and justice for all, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And even though we know that at the time there were gross injustices perpetrated against women and people of color and owned persons and so on, we also know that the aspiration of that kind doesn't stay still. An aspiration of E pluribus unum, an aspiration of freedom and justice for all, an aspiration and a vision that all human beings are created equal, grows, it spreads, it begins to generalize its influence on the constructive social forces of national organization and move society in a particular direction. And so it was unthinkable to us that a nation who had organized a scruffy army to defeat the largest and most powerful military force on the planet at the time, the British Army, a nation that had lost fully 2% of its entire population in the Civil War, a nation that had endured the Red Summers and the injustices of the Jim Crow South, that nation would retreat to those antiquated and obsolete values in order to champion the idea that white men, and particularly men, should be solely in charge of the governance and guidance of the American nation. We reflect on that time, and a few things come readily to mind. First, that this was a nation built of immigrants. Just think back to the American Revolution. The two greatest sources of military loss for the colonial army was not death by gunfire in active shooting. It was disease and desertion. And one of the challenges that was overcome so that the army could remain viable was the development of a vaccination program to prevent the soldiers from getting the pox. Now, George Washington himself initiated this program and commanded every soldier to be inoculated. But the inoculation, the formula, and the execution of it was done by a Muslim African slave who was a healer in Africa before he was captured and brought to America as a slave. And it was said about him that he had a way of preventing the soldiers from getting sick. And so Washington said, fine, we're going to inoculate everybody. And he did it. And as a result, he was able to keep his army alive. But you think about the great cities in the United States, or the railroads, or the infrastructure of the United States, and none of that was built by a single race. All of it was built by folks who came from several different continents looking for the same thing. And ironically, if you look at today's immigrant population, the Wall Street Journal itself had a summary of 100 years of studies of immigrant criminal behavior and violence on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Now, this is one of the most conservative magazines in the United States. It is primarily associated with the economic prosperity of our country and the world. And they wanted to know, what have studies said about immigrant populations in the United States and their effect on the stability of society as a whole? And what they concluded was that 100 years of studies of immigrant behavior indicated that they were the most peaceful and nonviolent population in the entire United States. The data is just not there, that we have to run from them or be fearful that they're going to bring a crime wave of violence. And while there are obviously individuals and small groups who break the law or perpetrate violence, that is not the pattern that is associated with the generality of immigrants that come to this country. They came for the reason that your forefathers came, and that is for a better life, to be free, to be the determinants of their own destiny. And so we think about what this might mean, because we are a nation that has been captured by the idea that we have something to fear. We have something to fear from the darkening of America. We have something to fear from immigrants. We have something to fear from cooperation with other nations. And it reminded me of a point that Gibbon made in his epic book, The Decline and Fall of Rome. He tells a story of a visitor from a far-off land who comes to Rome at its prime, at its peak. And he sees the architecture and the art, and he hears the poetry and reads the literature. He sees the scientific advancements, and he sees the ubiquitous wealth of the country. And when he finally has an opportunity to ask about this to another Roman, he says that he confesses his amazement of the astonishing progress and development represented by the Roman civilization. And he asks the Roman, he says, with all this wealth, with all this magnificence, where are the walls that will protect Rome? And the Roman says to him that the walls that protect Rome are in the hearts of the Romans, that they are the walls of knowledge, of science, of virtue, of value, of trustworthiness and truthfulness. And this is the point that our society and our world is beginning to reckon with, that we have to make peace with a global population. Now, some of us are arguing that the signs of the decline of democracy in the United States spell the end of democracy. They point to the rise of populism within the United States and around the world and suggest that autocratic rule is necessary to sustain progress. But this is not the vision that Baha'is have. Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, told us that we have two essential obligations. The first is to know and to worship God. And the second is to carry on an ever-advancing civilization. And if we look back over the course of time, we see that this instruction, this guidance, has never changed. Look back in the Old Testament of the Bible. And what it says is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Bible and the Old Testament set the expectation that we will go through a vast arc of development that will be characterized by repeated crises. But they help us understand that these crises will not stop our progress or limit our development. In fact, paradoxically, they will be springboards to advance our progress and to expand our understanding of the relationship of all people and the development of a unified society. And it sets expectations about what will happen in what they call the time of the end. And by that, they don't mean the end of the world materially. What they mean is the throwing off of limited understandings of who a human being can be, of limited understandings of the importance of nationhood, of limited understandings of the disparity between rich and poor, or the difference between black and white, or women and men. But a new world that embraces a broader understanding of human reality, of human cooperation, and of the ability to build a civilization that is prosperous and uplifting for every human being. That's what the Bible is talking about. And it tells us that during that time, our reality, our consciousness, our values, our modes of behavior will be transformed. The Bible says that when the Father comes, he will stamp the name of God on our foreheads and write his law on the inner tablets of our hearts. And by that, we understand that we would begin to think in a new way, that we would begin to think not in terms of fear and prejudice, but in terms of open-heartedness and cooperation. That the law of God would be written on the tablets of our heart, that we would have an open-hearted relationship to all human beings, that we would learn to build bridges of understanding and cooperation, and that we would forge bonds and ties among one another that are stronger than blood, and that overcome the prejudices of the past and build understandings that can launch a different kind of world. Well, the Bible also says that this will occur during an intensification of disorientation and confusion among human beings. They talk about the weeds and thistles that will crowd the meadows, that anywhere you turn, it'll be prickly and uncomfortable. You'll encounter sticks and thistles and all kinds of impediments that are disorienting and that appear to block your progress, but that we would navigate through that. And we would find our way to a clear understanding of the purpose of our creation. Now, if we look at modern reality and we ask ourselves, what is the true condition of the world? And is the world moving toward division and conflict? Or is it beginning to organize itself in a way that can give birth to a global civilization of understanding and cooperation and global prosperity, global well-being? The truth is that we see the best of times and the worst of times simultaneously. We look around, and any evidence you want to make, any evidence you want to use to reinforce the case for chaos and conflict is readily available because conflict is everywhere. But what I would ask you to consider is that while conflict is everywhere to be seen, so is unity. And it is developing right under our noses and beginning to reshape global reality. Now let's take a look at some of the material measures. You say, well, Bob, that's nice to say, and it sounds great, and it's uplifting to my heart, but you're going to need to prove that in order for me to believe that what you're telling me is the truth. So here's some of the proof that I would offer. First, we know that modern communications technology and modern travel has contracted the world into a neighborhood, and that now human beings are in touch with everybody on the planet at the blink of our cell phones. And there's no place on the planet that you are disconnected from every place else on the planet. But here are some other things to bear in mind. In the 1850s, just a blink ago in time, fully 85% of the global population of the world lived in extreme poverty. That is, they lived from hand to mouth. They lived short, unhealthy, and brutal lives of deprivation. Today, that figure on a global basis is 8.3% of the global population. And not only is it only 8.3% of the global population, but in the last 20 years, it has declined an additional 26%. So the world is getting richer. And what that means is that everything associated with it is beginning to prosper. First, 74% of the global population has moved into the working class and into the middle class. And that means that in places that had been marked by extreme poverty and deprivation, they are beginning to develop prosperity and well-being and health and longevity. One of the evidences of that is that just a few years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, the average life expectancy was about 45. Today, the global average life expectancy is 70. And what that tells you is people are healthier. Why? They're getting better food, they have better and cleaner water, and they have better access to healthcare. Second, global violence is lower than it has ever been in human history. And that is notwithstanding the fact that there are wars and conflicts in places like Ukraine and in the Middle East and so on. But the average The way this is measured is violent deaths per 100,000. And a useful way of thinking about this is to think about World War II, because then the entire world was shooting at each other. We were bombing each other and so forth. And there were about 7 deaths per 100,000. Today, it's about 0.3. And so while we know more about the violence that occurs, the actual rate of violence is much less than it has ever been in human history. Now, in addition to this, there are other very encouraging signs of the development of a cohesive and prosperous humanity. One is that just in the last 30 years, there has been a 75% decline in infant mortality. So now, not only are families healthier and more prosperous, but they are having healthy babies who live to term. And the result of that is that while a few decades ago, the average woman in a developing country had about just under 6 children, today it's 2.5. And the consequence is that all of those stories we heard about a 20 billion person global society, using up all the water and soaking up all the oxygen and so forth, none of that is going to come to pass. Now the current estimate is that the global population will top out at about 10 billion and then slowly decline. And that is a result of the fact that when babies are born, they live. Women and men, girls and boys, are being educated. You know, just a few years ago, the average rate of education of a girl in a developing country was 0. Today, it's 9th grade. That's revolutionary. The average rate of education for a young boy a few decades ago was 1st grade. Today, it's 10th grade. Now, all of that means dramatic change in the knowledge available to people, the knowledge they can use in order to make their lives better. They have greater prosperity than they have ever had. And they are forming organizations. One of the reasons that violence is in decline is that civil society is on the rise. And people are able to read, they're able to cooperate, they're able to solve more complex problems, they are able to contribute to the development of institutions that improve prosperity. I'll give you an example. I worked on a project in Africa that was to bring the first fiber optic cable from Europe and America to Africa. And the idea was to connect Africa to the World Wide Web for the first time in history. It was called Africa Connects to Europe, or ACE. And the idea was to build a broadband fiber optic cable from the coast of France down the west coast of Africa to Cape Town, and then penetrate inland to 45 different African countries. And this was accomplished in about 3 years and is operating. But here's the thing that's really interesting. One of the things that we argued for and was eventually adopted was the idea that this cable that has so much capacity, much of which would be unused, should be available to everyone, whether they can pay or they can't. And we made a very careful argument. All of the companies that could pay the fees to build and to take advantage of the cable were fine, and they were going to get richer and more prosperous. But we argued that if they wanted to see an aggregate increase in the prosperity and stability of the nations themselves, then they should take what's called dark fiber, that's just unused capacity, and give it away. Give it away to schools, to hospitals, to libraries, to non-governmental organizations, and to universities, all of whom need it but can't pay for it. And while there was huge resistance to this, ultimately they agreed. And as a result, kids in African villages are able to get the state curriculum on a computer monitor that is sustained by a solar panel and a little generator so that they can have systematic education. And these are enormous signs. Let me give you one other example, because once people begin to realize that they can become the protagonists of their own advancement, once they begin to get education, once they begin to develop steady and increasingly prosperous income, they begin to invest in schools and health. Those are the first two investments that African villagers made. They would hire a teacher and a nurse, and there would be a revolution in the education and the healthcare of their villages. But what's really amazing is that some of the smallest and least powerful nations on the planet are engaged in projects that will revolutionize the physical condition of the entire planet. And one great example is what's called the Great Green Wall. Now, if you can imagine the African continent, you know that at the top of it, in the fat part of the continent, in the geographic top, is mostly the Sahara Desert. And you know that deserts expand, they don't stay the same. And so if you don't stop it, that desert would take over the entire continent. So 23 African countries have joined together to build a 30-mile thick forest across the entire expanse of the African continent, from the East Coast to the West Coast, a 30-mile thick forest barrier, which will stop the spread of the Sahara Desert, and it will increase the amount of oxygen. It'll be the largest living organism on the planet. But in the process, those countries, which were started out more confederations of tribes than they were nation states with a sense of national identity, are gaining that identity and gaining a competence in international cooperation as they work with the other nations to build the forest, which, by the way, is almost complete. And so you see this transformation. And of course, because this project is very difficult, they had to build schools and water systems and highways and small businesses and clinics and birthing centers and all of the accoutrements of general society. So you see this transformation is occurring. And the last thing that I would mention is this. I mentioned at the beginning that the world is contracting into a neighborhood. And one of the ways we know this is that Africans are in Scandinavia in large numbers, and everybody is everywhere. Well, this diaspora that is occurring on a global scale isn't going to turn back. It's not going to stop. What it's going to result in is the intermingling of all humankind. And what we are witnessing is a fundamental and irreversible transformation in the physical organization of the global population of human beings, where it used to be that a human being was born, lived, and died within 40 miles of the same place. Now, the Earth is quite literally the home of all of its inhabitants, and people wander the globe to find the place they choose to live. So, I wanted to mention these things because they highlight the paradoxical opposite forces, those destructive forces of disintegration and conflict, and those constructive forces of the development of global unity and prosperity. And both of those forces are real. But I will tell you this, the intensification of the forces of conflict is brought about by the progress of the forces of construction. And so we've got to, I see some surprise on some faces. And just bear this in mind. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of the progress. But as the Bible says, the world will be flooded with one spirit. And the knowledge of God will cover the earth like water covers the oceans. That is our destiny. So I wanted to just mention this as a way to introduce the society building mission of the Baha'i faith, because the idea of the global Baha'i community is to systematically develop the capacity to build an ever advancing civilization in which every population will become the protagonist of their own advancement, and in which Baha'is open their arms in fellowship and cooperation to all human beings. Now, that doesn't mean we agree with everything that everybody thinks or does, but it does mean that we are willing to engage in a constructive effort to find points of agreement. Let me give you an example. A friend of mine, a Baha'i, had at the end of her block a couple that were outspoken advocates of white supremacy. They believed all of the things, that the nation was at risk of immigrants, that people of color were going to take over the nation to the peril of the nation itself, and that the nation would be better off if it returned to white male rule under the dome of Christianity. Now, that's not, as people in the church like to say, that's not what my Bible says. My Bible is far more embracing, but that is what they believed. So she went over to their house one day. They had a beautiful garden in their front yard, and she invited them to dinner. And she had as her aim the development of real friendship. Now, if you're going to develop real friendship, that means you're going to listen more than you're going to talk. And it means that you're going to embrace ideas and really search for points of agreement. But one of the first and most important things that opened that conversation was the fact of the magnificent flower garden they had in their front yard. And she talked about the diversity of flowers making the garden even more magnificent. And that became a discussion about the diversity of human contributions to the progress of society. Now, obviously, that discussion proceeded at its own pace, but it was the beginning of a discussion that would formulate understandings and serve as the foundation of cooperation for a unified neighborhood. I I sat in the living room of a 81-year-old white woman, a Baha'i, from Indiana, and she had moved to a Black neighborhood in Florence, South Carolina. And she had started a junior youth group of kids from the neighborhood who were learning about their own nobility, learning about the teachings of all the religions, learning about the spiritual motive of love that prompted God to create us in the first place. And I sat and I watched these kids and I asked them, I said, you know, who are you? Kind of, what are you learning? And one little skinny 12-year-old Black youth said, and he was he was twitchy. He just had all kinds of electric energy going on all the time. And he said, you know, I wanted to be a lawyer. I said, well, why is that? He said, because lawyers are the boss of everybody. And, you know, I figured if I was a lawyer, I'd be the boss of somebody and I'd be okay. He said, but since I've joined this group, I've decided that I'm not going to be a lawyer. I said, well, what are you going to be? He said, I've decided that I'm going to be a second grade math teacher. I said, well, why is that? He said, because if I can convince 7-year-old Black kids that they're smart, it'll change their lives. That's what we're talking about. That's exactly what we're talking about. When a 12-year-old can take that kind of position and say, I can have an impact on other people's lives, and I can convince little kids that they're smart and they matter and that they're beautiful and that they can do things that will make life better for them and for other people, that's a useful position for me to be in. And for a kid at 12 to come to that conclusion is revolutionary. The Baha'i faith on a global scale is trying to do that work with kids from all backgrounds and all races and all religions and all economic groups, to convince little children and junior youth and adults that they can have this kind of effect, this kind of transformational effect on the progress of their friends and their neighborhoods and so on. I'll tell you what these little kids were doing in Florence, South Carolina. They had become so possessed with the idea that they matter and that they can take charge of things. They had agency, as we say these days. That they had decided what their development plan for the neighborhood was. And this is what it included. The first thing they had done was they knew that one of the elder women in the neighborhood had just passed away. And her house was closed up because she had just passed. And her garden was untended and the grass wasn't cut and so forth. But they also knew that she had taken great pride in her little flower garden. So in her honor, they cut her grass and they weeded her flower garden so that it would be the way it was when she was alive. And they began to look around the neighborhood aggressively for things they could do that would improve the lot and life of other people in the neighborhood. Well, I could tell you more and more stories about this group, but the more important thing is that this kind of activity is going on all over the world. And as you begin to engage little kids in this idea that they are noble and have purpose, that they matter and can have effect. And as they grow into youth who will assume responsibility, and as they come of age and they become focused on social action that will advance the development of society. And as they begin to think about how to build a family and how to serve humanity, just think about the difference. In a culture whose operational model is me, mine, and more, what we're talking about are developing generations of young people and adults who are focused on us, on the well-being of everyone, and the advancement and the comfort of everyone. So this all stems from the vision of the Baha'i faith, which was so beautifully articulated in the Baha'i writings, which talk about seeing humanity differently, not as separate branches of humanity divided by color and ethnic origin and national origin, but as flowers in the same garden, as blossoms on the same branch. The Baha'i writings tell us that we should see every stranger as an intimate friend, that we should put an end to foreignness and banish alienation, that we must convert every enemy into a brother or a sister. And even, they say, that we must offer a helping hand to our fallen oppressor. Those writings reorient our sense of purpose in life. And they tell us that we should turn away from self-aggrandizement and the accumulation of material and social power as the purpose of our lives, and turn our vision instead to that way of living and being and serving that would bring happiness to the inmates of heaven. And so those writings tell us that we should be a father or mother to the orphan, a cure for the ailing, and an uplifter of every victim of oppression. And they say that we must be intrepid and true-hearted. They say that as we engage in these activities systematically and consistently, we will encounter opposition. But they tell us that we should respond with sincere kindness and not with appearance only. And they explain to us that as we do this, it will release the spiritual dynamic that was the motive of creation itself, and which will begin to invade the hearts and the minds and the institutions and the ways of life of larger and larger groups of people. So when the Bible tells us that the name of God will be stamped on our foreheads and the law of God will be written on the inner tablets of our hearts, this isn't a magical process that happens while we're asleep. It is a process that results from a conscious and determined and persistent effort to transform the way we see each other, the way we understand our individual purpose in life, and the patterns that we engage in to build our lives. So let me make this last comment, and then we'll open up for questions and comments. The Baha'i faith emphasizes that freedom of prejudice of every kind is the supreme injunction of the teachings of Baha'u'llah and the hallmark of a true Baha'i character. And so freedom of prejudice, racial, ethnic, religious, gender-based, prejudice of any kind is our motto. And they tell us that we must not simply champion these values behind microphones or at conferences, but construct a way of life that puts these values front and center as the guiding lights of our daily lives. And so they tell us that in every aspect of life, we have to integrate these values and this approach to the way we do things. They say in the way we think and relate to one another. They say when our children are at play, in our moments of leisure, in our business and professional activities, in our social gatherings, in the operation of our institutions, in every aspect, we have to integrate these values, bring diversity to the service of human prosperity and well-being, and that the result of this will be blessings and assistance from the world beyond. In fact, they say not only will we benefit individually and collectively from this persistent effort, but they say that if we pause, if we hesitate, those blessings will be suspended. And so we take it in our hearts to be servants of all humankind with the vision that this commitment to service will fulfill the ancient promise that was made in the beginning of recorded time, when the Bible says that we will come to a time when the kingdom of heaven will be established on earth. And that kingdom of heaven will be characterized by the light in our hearts, by the quality of our relationships to one another, by our devotion to God, and by our commitment to activating that devotion in the way we treat each other. At the end of the day, the Baha'i writings say that if we engage in this approach to life, if we labor in this way to bring this spirit and to help humanity solve the difficult challenges that it faces, we will bring an end to ignorance and pain and banish the darkness of humanity forever and ever. So, as the cowboys say, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I'll turn it back to our moderator, and whatever you all have to say in reply, you can say, "Bah humbug, Bob, that's way too positive." Yeah, but I'm going to stick to it. But we'd love to hear your comments and your questions, and we'll do what we can to answer them.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was really interesting. Now we have time for Q&A, so people can put their questions in the chat. The first question is, while these statistics are encouraging overall, aren't there still extremes, and the gap between those at the lowest end of the economic range and those at the upper end is still as great and maybe even greater?
So read the last part of that again.
Those at the upper end, so the range between those at the upper end and lower end is still as great, if not greater.
Yeah, both things are true at the same time. It is true that there are more billionaires than ever existed. It is true that there are more millionaires than ever existed. At the same time, when 74% of the global population moves into the working class, you've made a huge gain. And what that means is that people live longer, they eat better, they get more medical care, they get education, their kids live when they're born, and so on. So both things are true. And one truth does not negate the other one. So the thing to look at is, yep, we got work to do on building an economic organization that sustains everyone. And there are two things to bear in mind here. One is that at the current rate of economic disenfranchisement of African American people in the United States, by the year 2035, which is only 10 years from now, the net wealth of the average African American will be zero. That's frightening. And it has real implications for the instability of civil society, for the decline in every metric of human well-being. So this really is a challenge that we have to deal with. At the same time, there are developmental efforts that offer great promise for solutions to the very same problems. So, you know, what it says is, let's get busy and focus on the work that we can do to aid those constructive measures to have the transformational impact that they can have. Because one of the things that many people who are advancing ideas that are racially discriminatory and restrictive, they don't realize what it costs the nation as a whole. And I'll just I'll quantify that for you. Citibank published a study not too long ago, about 2 years ago. And one of the things they said was that the cost of racial discrimination to the American economy from 2000 to 2020 was about $1.3 trillion a year. And they specified all the leaks in the economy that were attributable to discrimination. And then they said something even more concerning. They said for all kinds of reasons, including the intensification of those discriminatory practices, the economic cost of discrimination to the American economy would rise from 2020 on to $3.5 trillion per year. So, you know, we're not simply talking about the destructive effects of racial discrimination to human beings. We're also talking about the systemic impact of those destructive practices to society itself. And because we now know that all nations are totally intertwined. You can't differentiate what happens in China to what happens to the American economy, to what happens in Latin America, and so on. It's just not possible anymore. And there's no such thing as a nation retreating to an island to take care of itself with no engagement of other nations. You simply can't do it. So we are going to be forced by all these imperatives to do what God wanted us to do in the first place, and that is figure out how to get along and figure out how to promote the general prosperity of everyone. I'll tell you a cute story. Abdu'l-Baha, the son of the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, made a visit to the United States for the better part of a year. And during that period, he talked about the elimination of racial prejudice, the elimination of gender bias, the development of dynamic stability between rich and poor. And when he returned to New York from his tour of the United States, he was asked by a reporter for the New York Times. And the reporter said, we hear you talking about the elimination of the disparity between rich and poor. Are you against rich people? And Abdu'l-Baha's response was, no, I just want everybody to be rich. Well, that's exactly where we are. We want everybody to do well.
Thank you. The next question is, how can we as Baha'is balance the Anglo-Christian culture of individual salvation and contemporary positivism with Let your vision be world embracing and be anxiously concerned with the exigencies of the world.
Well, I would take some issue with the premise of the question. I don't know that we balance anything. I'm looking at the faces, at your beautiful faces on the screen, and I have one of those Apple computers with a screen that is bigger than the old TVs used to be. This thing's huge, so I can see everybody. But I'm betting that most, if not all of us, have raised kids. And one of the things we learned about raising kids is you've got to start where that child is. You don't determine everything you're going to do and focus the child to be the way you want them to be. What you do is you try to uplift the vision and inspire the heart of that child so that the child can be the best that she or he can be. And you understand that there are going to be lots of twists and turns in that developmental process. Well, the same is true in society as a whole. I can't come to your house and tell you that you've got an imbalance. But what I can do is I can come to your house, or I can invite you to my house, and I can ask you to tell me your story. And we can start what becomes a genuine friendship. And in that genuine friendship, we can begin to see the growth of trust and confidence. And in the growth of trust and confidence, we can begin to work together on common concerns. So I'll give you an example. There's a neighborhood in Washington, D.C., where the neighbors began to come together for devotional meetings. And everybody brought their own sacred scripture, whether it was a poem or the Bible or the Quran or the Baha'i writings or the Bhagavad Gita. Everybody came together in a spirit of the people in the neighborhood beginning to pray together about the things they wanted to have happen. Now, there was lots of diversity in the room, racial diversity, religious diversity, all kinds of diversity. But they all agreed that they wanted everybody to be happy, and everybody contributed to that in prayer. Over time, those devotional meetings became consultations. And the focus of the consultation was, what can we do to make our little community better? What are the things that we can do? And they began physical projects of beautification. They began caring for everybody's kids, not just my kids. They began organizing collective activity. They began talking about some of the social issues on which they disagreed, to begin to exchange views and build bridges of understanding. And while that didn't change everybody into one way of thinking, what it did was it established common ground, and it established trust and confidence. So, I think that lots of folks will have divergent points of engagement, but that's okay. And what we need to do is kind of understand, why do we believe what we believe? And what are your thoughts? And what are those points of agreement that we might collaborate on that would help us make life better for everyone? That's where we are. And gradually that progresses and it becomes whatever it becomes. But I'm not here to change you. I'm here to offer some ideas that I commend to your consideration. And you talk back and you say, well, Bob, I like this, but I don't like that. I think this is a good idea, but I don't think that is. And that's where we start a conversation. And that conversation is part me and part you. But it's not me telling you how to be. It's us figuring out who we can be to each other and what we can accomplish together.
Thank you. The next question is, would you be able to elaborate on the situation of the Middle East? When will our beloved country of Iran and the Baha'is in that country be free? Are we far away from peace in that region, or will we have a chance to witness their freedom and recognition sometime soon?
I have no way to predict when that will happen or to see clearly the complexities that surround that dynamic. I would say this about Iran. If you go back and look at the letter the international governing body of the Baha'i faith wrote to the people of Iran in 2013, what you will find is that the entire, what we call the 9-year plan of society building, of collective engagement and so forth, is in that letter in 2013. Now, that letter was not addressed to just the Baha'is of Iran. It was addressed to the people of Iran. And it was a clarion call to the population of Iran to make Iran a great and respected nation, to uplift its social, spiritual, economic, and political status in the eyes of all nations. And to do that on the basis of spiritual beliefs that are fundamental to Baha'is and to members of other religions. Now, that process has to occur in all nations. Iran is one, but every other nation is not exempt. But in terms of being able to predict what the outcome would be or when it would occur, I don't know anyone who could do that.
Thank you. To what extent is the story of Western nations forcing indirect slavery on developing nations, especially those in Africa, true? Don't you think that while humanity, Baha'is, work to bridge the divide, the other side is using deceptive means to widen it as well?
You know, I think no, I don't. The short answer is no, I don't agree with that. All nations have their developmental challenges. Name me the nation that is doing everything the way we would want. I don't know what that nation is. I think that the very nature of our global conflict is that all of us change our assumptions about how development occurs and about the value that different nations bring to human well-being and human prosperity. I think that as we evolve, the issue will be the global well-being and global prosperity of all people. And by that, I mean education, I mean health, I mean the ability to work, I mean the freedom from food insecurity. I mean a system of international cooperation. Let's remember that one of the prophecies of the Bible that the Baha'i faith addresses is that the Comforter, whose name will be wonderful, who will be the Father predicted by all the religions, will judge among the nations. And let us remember that the Baha'i writings describe that judgment and give assignments to the nations. And one of the assignments given to the nations is to a Western nation, to the United States of America. And what the assignment is that we would bind the hands of the broken with the rod of justice and work toward the upliftment and prosperity of the disenfranchised and the downtrodden, that we would commit ourselves to the meek inheriting the earth and be the proponents of international cooperation and peace. And in fact, those writings go on to describe things that you and I can do that will advance that process. And that includes the elimination of prejudice and the promotion of a prejudice-free community and society and school, the elimination of gender bias, a commitment to social action that uplifts the condition of people. I'll give you an example. There's a community in Pendleton, Oregon, which is to say in the middle of nowhere. These folks are 250 miles away from the largest town. Their backyard are the mountains, and Portland is like 250 miles away. And as far as anybody was concerned, their little town had no problems. Everybody was working. The town looked good. Low rates of violence and crime, and so on. The Baha'i community there scruffled up a few pennies, and they were able to establish a Baha'i center. And so once they established a Baha'i center, they wanted to dedicate the center to be the home of Baha'i activities, but also serve the community. So what they did was they went door to door in the community, and they said, "What do you need? You know, what are the issues that this community has?" And one of the things that they found out was that there was food insecurity in a place that everybody thought was prosperous. But it was lurking behind the door where folks were employed, but they didn't have enough to make ends meet. And so they were able to organize the city government, the town council, the school system, the faith communities, and the non-governmental organizations to provide better food distribution in a dignified way to folks who, although they had jobs, would fight with periodic bouts of food insecurity. You know, that's where we got to go. You know, we've got to find ways to connect with the people in our communities, to ascertain their needs, and then to create favorable conditions for people to cooperate and sustain cooperation to meet the collective need. Now, what happened as a result of this? Well, the first thing that happened was that there was better food distribution, and families that needed food would get it. But the second thing that happened was that people began to talk about the larger spectrum of their needs, what the kids need, how parents could cooperate, ways that they could work together to economize on things that were commonly needed by families so that they could provide. You see, and that was a process not of dictation, but of discovery, not of direction, but of service. I think that's what the 9-year plan is calling us toward. And that's what will create a different kind of environment for people to prosper and be well.
Thank you. Someone asked, can you please give us some advice for when we think our efforts might not be successful and we feel a kind of disconnect?
Yeah, you know, now I'm the only person on this screen that's old, but I'm old, and I love it because it answers a lot of questions. You know, hard-won insights. But here's one of my hard-won insights. I discovered that I have the power to make happiness. I can do it. And I discovered that that power lies in practices that my faith asks me to engage in. For example, I discovered that I can greet every human being I see with a smiling face. And I discovered that habituating that practice makes everything better. I discovered that if I was more interested in other folks than I was in myself and my ideas, that the gateways to trust and confidence opened faster and wider. And I discovered that if I decided to say, hey, what are we both concerned about and where might we start? As opposed to, I want to do this way at this time. More folks wanted to join in because they felt a common sense of ownership. And so as a result, and I also discovered that setbacks had valuable learning content. And that, because if you've been alive, I'll tell you, I'll say it in another way. Anybody who's been married 20 minutes has had marital problems. Am I the only one, or is this a shared experience? Okay. So here's what I learned. Marital happiness and longevity is not the result of not having marital problems. It's a result of learning how to solve them, of learning how to talk about them. Well, the same is true for life itself. We don't get good at this because we don't have problems. We get good at this because we use our problems to drive progress and to try new approaches to the challenges we face. So if we feel disconnected, or if we feel like what we're doing is not working, or if we feel like, gee, we tried a bunch of times, but it's just not working out for us, then it's a great opportunity for us to reflect and figure out what we might do additionally or differently. Thomas Edison had a great response. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. And he was hailed as a genius for it. And Lord knows I love light. But he was asked about the invention process. And he said, how did you discover this? He said, first, I discovered 6,000 ways how not to make a light bulb. And then I discovered one way to make a light bulb. Well, that's us. We're going to have a lot of ways for this not to work. But we're also going to find a lot of ways for it to make progress. And so just think about our proposition. Our proposition is not that we're smart enough to figure all this out. Our proposition is that we can pray enough, and we can have goodness in our heart enough, and we can be sincere enough, and we can be steadfast enough to earn the blessings of heaven, and that they will help us. So in the Baha'i writings, there is a piece of guidance, and unfortunately this isn't published. It's in a letter, an unpublished letter. But basically what it says is that when you make a plan, God dispenses a cohort of angels to assist you with the progress of that plan. And it says, if you pray about that plan, then the number of angels at your service increases. And then it says, if you act on that plan, the number of angels increases still more. And then finally it says, and if you persevere, then you will get the maximum amount of heavenly aid available to any soul. Well, that's our story. We have to keep at it. And as you can see, obviously the Lord is patient, because if we look back over the expanse of human history, I started some time ago, I said that in the 1850s, I said 85, but it was actually 89% of the human population lived in extreme poverty. That's absolutely true. It's measurable. It's documented. So from the beginning of recorded history to the 1850s, the limitations of prosperity were so extreme that it actually restricted the number of calories taken in by the average person every day. Now, in the 1850s, what happened to the global domestic product was that it went from flat to straight up. Number of calories doubled, the amount of money doubled, knowledge started to increase, social and corporate organization began to increase, and so forth. And of course, now knowledge is doubling at a frightening rate, and we don't even know what that means. But all these things are happening so that we can have tools to make life better and to make real the promises that were made in the Bible and all the holy books about the establishment of a social, spiritual, political, and economic condition that would be characterized by harmony, cooperation, love, and commitment to service.
Thank you. So maybe we'll do one more question. We're encouraged to take hold of local issues that we can influence. What approach should we take to international issues that we can't influence?
The old phrase was think globally, but act locally. There's nothing I can do about things happening in other nations, but there is something I can do about here. And so the question is, I'll give you an example. In my Baha'i community, during the pandemic, before the pandemic, our Baha'i community had children's classes, junior youth activities, and youth activities in an apartment complex that was dominated by working people and people of limited means. And in fact, our community rented an apartment in that complex, and it was really going well. Then the pandemic happens and everything's on lockdown. So the community knew that people would be in distress, and it found sources of surplus food. And it found a distributor who carried that food and who was willing to contribute it. And so the community organized the deposit of surplus foodstuffs on a weekly basis to the complex in which we were making friends and providing service. And every Thursday afternoon, members of the community would go knocking door to door and say, the truck has come and food is in the common area outside. And people were able to get canned goods and cereals and meats and food and eggs and milk and butter and so on, which was a real response. But what was also a real response was their confidence that we didn't come and go. That when the circumstance changed, our commitment to service was unwavering. And we simply found other ways to serve. And you can imagine when the doors opened up again and we were coming out of lockdown, the kinds of conversations we were able to have were richer and more trusting and more substantial because the community had demonstrated itself to be a true friend. So.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today and giving us this talk and answering our questions.
Well, it was my pleasure. I had agreed to do it earlier, but we had a loss in the family and I wasn't able to to do it then. I'm so happy to be able to do it now, and so happy to see all of your beautiful faces and to have an opportunity to share some ideas. I hope they were helpful.
Definitely. Thank you so much. So our speaker next week will be Mr. Grant Pierce, and he'll be talking about the practical applications of the Baha'i writings. And again, this talk will be on YouTube. And so I'll put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye.